Hello everyone, my name is Elijah Cole and I'm presenting my project on the protests on Mauna Kea, which is an island in Hawaii. So, one of the main reasons why I actually picked this topic is because I was on vacation in Hawaii with my family while the protests began. Um, they were, we were on the touristy island of Oahu and the actual protests were happening in Mauna Kea. And seeing there were actually some protests still on the other islands, whether it be on the side of the roads or even through some of the performances that we actually got to see. One of the performances we saw, they actually have this, like I guess their logo or their kind of go-to thing that they do this right here, which kind of symbolizes the Mauna Kea protests, and if you do this, then you stand with them. And so seeing that throughout my entire vacation in Hawaii kind of had that impact on me and made me want to talk about this more and share with all of y'all. To kind of start off with the who, what, where, when, why, how, and so what. The who are the native Hawaiians and the scientists. The what are the local activists protesting a $1.4 billion telescope being built on a temporarily inactive volcano. And what's happening are the protesters are actually blocking the only road that goes up to the top of the mountain, so they can't bring in all the supplies and equipment to build the telescope. The where is the Hawaii's biggest island on the summit of Mauna Kea. The when is June 20th, 2019, when they got the go-ahead for construction to start building in mid-July. And as far as I'm concerned, the first day of protests were actually on July 15th. The why. Scientists want to build the telescope there because it is 14,000 feet above the sea level and the island provides very little to no light pollution, which is very good for telescopes and makes all the difference in the world when there's that much less light pollution. The natives don't want it there because it is the highest point in Hawaii, and it is seen as a sacred place where the sky goddess Wakea met with the earth goddess Papahānaumoku, which came to create these beautiful Hawaiian islands. The how. So Hawaii natives were okay with a few telescopes being built on top of the mountain. They're saying that one more on top of the dozen that's already existing is just one too many, and it's just more disrespect to the sacred place. They said it was okay for a few, but when they keep saying one more, they're not letting it pass by. The so what? So still in a battle, and in response, scientists are aiming to possibly move the telescope to La Palma, which is in the Canary Islands of Spain, but it is still a little less of the expectations as Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea is the much more preferred one for the scientists due to its, again, little to no light pollution and the 14,000 feet, whereas the Canary Islands are a little less in both those standards. So let's go ahead and talk about the sources. So I have 4 sources picked out. One is the Associated Press State Wire for Hawaii. The second source that I have is the NPR. It's the NPR source, which is pretty widely known. Everyone kind of knows what NPR is and what they do. So that's why I picked it as my mainstream source. Third source that I picked is my mainstream local newspaper, so this is more of a local perspective. This source is called the Honolulu Star Advertiser. And for my fourth source, which is the out of the mainstream source, was this organization I found online where they share these news. It's called Science X Network, and they were more so on the scientific side of the telescope. So pretty good coverage over all of the sources and perspectives of the sources as well. So let's go ahead and jump into the leads for all of these sources and the kind of differences and maybe similarities in them. It's between all of the sources in general. I had one that was on July 23rd. One of the others, the second source, the NPR source, was actually published on July 15th, which was the first day of the protests. so that was the first and immediate one to get out to everyone. The third source, the mainstream local one, was actually published on September 25th, 2019, and the last source was published on September 28th, 2019. So I have two sources that are right around when the first protest started beginning, and then the other two sources I have are kind of more of is a month after the event and more so about how everything is moving along. Second source, the NPR source, really brought out all the who, what, where, when, why, how, whereas the source one, the Associated Press source, was kind of direct and more so about the movement across the nation. So how many people were protesting and how it impacted people even in the mainland. Source 3 is the local newspaper, and so for this source I kind of noticed the lead for the local newspaper, the third source, had more of a tone that was positive in the anti-telescope movement, and in the fourth source, the lead was out of the mainstream source sounded more negative towards the protesters and was more pro-telescope. So those two sources kind of contradicted there, and the first two sources were pretty fair in representing both sides of the conflict. So the second point I wanted to bring up is the accuracy between all of the sources. And for the most part, all of them were very accurate, just a little more biased, maybe towards one side or the other, whether it be for pro-telescope or anti-telescope. More specifically, in source 1, it was the most accurate with all the sources just due to the fact that it actually had, facts stated by actual people. So, for example, state officials said the crowd stood at 1,500 on Monday after swelling to 2,000 over the weekend. So, with this source, saying that, for example, is perfectly fine because they actually have the fact with whoever said it, so it's the support bringing it back. Source 2 didn't have as much official backup information. They kind of just threw numbers out, and so it kind of made it look unsupported. This is for the NPR source, where they kind of just threw out facts, like, for example, about 300 demonstrators are trying to halt construction on the controversial 30-meter telescope. Like, who said that? I don't know. That was kind of the one thing I noticed about Source 2, was, yes, there were some people backing it up, and they kind of cited it, but there's also some lines like that, whereas in the first source, it was pretty much all backed up whenever they said something. Yeah, so for the third source, they had plenty of sources and polls and attributions, so they actually kind of almost overwhelmed me with how many different facts they had and how many different polls they had presenting throughout the entire paper. And for the fourth source, some information wasn't backed up fully by attributions, but it was leading to be semi-accurate. So compared to the rest of the sources, for the fourth source that was out of the mainstream, going through it, I had that impression of it being semi-accurate, and it was. There was some truth, and there were some that were like, I don't know if that's 100% true or not. Next thing I wanted to cover were the attributions and the multimedia presented within these sources. In source 1, the Associated Press source, it had 4 different attributions, but with no multimedia. This was a newspaper article that I pulled from Newsbank. It just had a very neutral tone throughout the source, so this was what I kind of mentioned earlier, where it presented both sides. It was 2 attributions on the government side and 2 attributions on the scientist side, so they kind of collided and they had a fair representation of this conflict. In source 2, the NPR source, they also had 4 different attributions, but this time they had 3 images and they were all cited for multimedia. Which is kind of why I like the NPR source, because it was a more user-friendly source for myself. Also with the NPR source, they had a very neutral tone throughout the entire publication, and they represented both sides of the conflict pretty evenly. Not as much as the Associated Press one, but they did cover both sides pretty fairly. And for the third source, the mainstream local newspaper, they also had 4 different attributions. All of the sources had 4 different attributions, just with pictures and polls and others that separated them. Another thing that I noticed with the local newspapers, they actually had the most information as far as polls. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm sure this local newspaper went out to the local city around Mauna Kea and actually, got got people to take these surveys. The tone of this source was kind of more anti-telescope, given that it's the local newspaper, so they're obviously very with the movement of the people living there first for Hawaii. For source 4, the out of mainstream source, the Science X network source also had 4 different attributions, and they had 3 different images for multimedia. The tone of this source was actually more towards the scientists, given the background of what they talk about on this organization. So to be more pro-telescope was a good perspective to kind of balance out from the local newspaper source that I picked out. So in conclusion, I kind of just want to reestablish, I think, what source was the best, and by far it was the Associated Press article, just because everything that they said was backed up by a actual source. So when they have all of that combined, it just kind of stumps over all of the other sources. I don't think there was a bad source. All of the sources were pretty fair across the board, and just with different perspectives and tones towards the conflict. So I'm going to say there was no bad source out of all of them. My favorite source is the NPR source because of the multimedia, and while it representing both sides of the conflict very fairly, it kind of gives the reader his or her decision to choose which side to be on for the telescope, while it being very easy to read and very fun to read. I think my least favorite source was the mainstream local newspaper, just because it had so many facts and polls that I kind of really just didn't really care about those numbers as much. Like when they kind of just stuff all the numbers into one paragraph, it kind of just didn't affect me in a positive way. So for the current updates, they're still trying to build the telescope there, even with the protesters still doing their thing, blocking the road. They've kind of come to a stalemate almost. Okay, so I'm not sure what's going to happen next, but I hope that it gets resolved very soon. Thank you guys for watching my current events project. I hope you guys have a better understanding of the Mauna Kea protests. Thank you guys. Have a good day.